You were taught a simple story. Humans evolved in Africa, one species, one origin point. Somewhere around 300,000 years ago, modern humans emerged, and then we spread across the globe. You've probably seen the chart. It's in textbooks. It's definitive. But in 2024, researchers at Cambridge University ran advanced genome analysis on populations across the world, and they found something that rewrites that entire story. Modern humans didn't come from one ancestral population. We came from at least two, and they diverged 1.5 million years ago. What that means and why nobody is talking about it is what we're diving into today. Let's start with what you were taught, because it matters. The standard model is called the recent African origin theory. Here's the idea. In Africa, around 300,000 years ago, a single population of humans evolved. They had modern anatomy, modern brains, and eventually they migrated out of Africa, replacing all other human species, Neanderthals, Denisovans, everyone else. By around 70,000 years ago, they'd spread to every continent. This theory made sense. It was clean, it was singular, one species, one origin. And for decades, it was treated as settled science. Textbooks were written, documentaries were made. The model became so dominant that questioning it felt almost heretical. We were the children of Africa, one branch of the human tree. That was the story. But here's where the problem started. The deeper geneticists looked, the messier the story became. In 2024, a team led by researchers at Cambridge Department of Genetics analyzed genetic data from modern human populations across Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Pacific. They used advanced computational methods, the kind that can now track the deep history of populations by looking at tiny variations in your DNA. What they found was not one ancestral population splitting and migrating. They found evidence of at least two distinct ancestral populations. And here's the crucial part. Those populations diverged 1.5 million years ago. Let that sink in. 1.5 million years. That's not a recent split. That's ancient. Now, this isn't the first time researchers have found something unexpected in human genetics. In fact, the evidence has been building for over a decade. But this Cambridge study is the most comprehensive, and it makes the pattern impossible to ignore. You see, around 2010, scientists discovered something weird in the DNA of modern humans. We carried genetic markers that didn't fit the recent African origin model. Some of those markers looked like they came from populations that split off much earlier than the standard 300,000-year timeline. Then, in 2019, a study of ancient DNA from West African populations showed that human ancestry was even more complex than anyone realized. There were ancient admixtures, meaning ancient populations mixing together, that the single origin model couldn't explain. And then, 2023 brought another bombshell. A study in Nature Genetics found that non-African humans carry genetic material from multiple distinct African source populations, not one, multiple. By the time the Cambridge team finished their analysis in 2024, the picture became clear. Let's walk through what we now believe happened. Around 1.5 million years ago in Africa, there were at least two distinct hominin populations. They shared a common ancestor much further back, maybe 2.5, maybe 3 million years ago. But something caused a split. Maybe climate change, maybe geographic isolation, maybe competition for resources. We don't know yet. These two populations evolved separately for over 1 million years. Population A, let's call it the Eastern lineage, developed in East Africa and parts of Asia. They were the ancestors of what would become more robust, powerful-bodied hominins. They were the ones who eventually gave rise to some of the Neanderthal-like features we see in the fossil record. Population B, the Western lineage, developed in Central and West Africa. They maintained certain genetic and physical characteristics that would eventually become more associated with anatomically modern humans. Smaller jaws, larger brains, different metabolic pathways. For over 1 million years, they existed in relative separation. Then, around 200,000 years ago, something changed. Climate shifts, resource pressures, or maybe just exploration. The two populations began to encounter each other again, and when they did, they interbred. This is where it gets interesting. When two populations that have been isolated for over 1 million years come back into contact, the genetic mixing doesn't happen evenly. It's chaotic. Some regions of the genome from one population might be selected against, meaning they don't survive in offspring. Other regions are selected for. They actually increase in frequency because they confer some advantage. What the Cambridge team found in the genetic data was exactly this pattern. Modern humans carry a mosaic of genetic markers. Some regions of our genome show deep ancestry going back to that eastern lineage. Other regions show ancestry from the western lineage. And the patterns of mixing suggest not a single merger, but multiple waves of contact, separation, and recontact over tens of thousands of years. You are not purely descended from one ancestral population. You are a hybrid. Not in the way the word usually gets used, not in some dramatic science fiction way, but in the literal genetic sense. You carry the accumulated DNA of populations that were separate for over 1 million years. This is now scientific consensus. The recent African origin model, the one that taught you there was one ancestor, is being quietly retired in academic circles. It's being replaced by what researchers call the multiple African origins model. But here's the thing that's strange. This isn't front-page news. You didn't hear about it. Neither did most people. One of the most fundamental discoveries about where we come from, and it barely made a ripple outside of academic journals. So, what does this actually mean? On the surface level, it's just a correction to our evolutionary history. We were wrong about something, now we're less wrong. That happens in science all the time. But dig deeper and it becomes something more unsettling. For the last 100 years, the single origin story had a powerful hidden narrative. It went like this: all humans come from the same place. We're all equally descended from the same ancestral population. Therefore, genetic differences between populations are recent and superficial. Therefore, racial categories are biological nonsense. And scientifically, that conclusion was correct. But the new model complicates the story. If modern humans are the product of at least two ancestral populations that diverged for over 1 million years, then yes, genetic differences between populations today are still recent and superficial in evolutionary terms, but the history is longer and more complex. Different modern human populations carry different ratios of ancestry from those two ancient lineages. East Asian populations, for instance, seem to carry a higher proportion of ancestry from what might have been a more robust, cold-adapted Eastern lineage. West African populations carry stronger ancestry signals from the Western lineage. Europeans carry a complicated mixture from multiple waves of migration and mixing, including significant ancestry from non-African populations that themselves had complex histories. None of this means any population is better or more evolved. Evolution doesn't work that way. But it does mean that modern human populations have genuinely different deep histories. And that brings us to a harder question. What do we do with that information? For decades, we could say all humans are the same because we all came from one place. Simple, egalitarian, and, as it turns out, slightly inaccurate. Now we have to say, all humans are equally valuable and deserving of dignity, but we have genuinely different evolutionary histories. That's harder to articulate and harder to believe, especially in a world that has spent centuries using pseudo-scientific claims about human difference to justify hierarchy and oppression. The truth is, modern genetics gives us no reason to rank populations. Genetic diversity within populations is greater than diversity between them. And the genetic differences that do exist between populations are neutral. They code for things like skin pigmentation or altitude adaptation, not intelligence or capability. But the mere fact that we have different histories now feels significant in a way it didn't when we all came from one place. And that discomfort, that's worth paying attention to. Here's what we still don't know. We don't know exactly when these populations split. We have 1.5 million years as a rough estimate, but it could have been earlier. We don't know exactly where they lived. Our fossil record is incomplete. We don't know why they split or what selective pressures drove them to evolve differently. We don't know how many distinct populations there actually were. Was it 2, 3, 5? The current evidence suggests at least 2, but there may have been more. And we don't know how future genetic analysis will reveal when it becomes even more sophisticated. In other words, we're at the beginning of understanding our own origins, not the end. The old story was simple. This new one is complicated, and the complicated truth is often harder to live with than the simple lie. So here's what I want to know. If we're not from one ancestral population, if we're the product of 2 populations that evolved separately for over 1 million years before mixing, what does that change about how you think about human difference? Does it make you more or less comfortable with the idea that populations today have genuinely different histories? Or does it not change anything? Is the deeper truth that human unity and human diversity are 2 sides of the same coin and always have been? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to explore more about what modern genetics is revealing about our past, subscribe, because this story is still being written.